All right, well, it's good to be with you for another discipleship video. We're in week 6 of Mark's Gospel, looking really here at Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 52, all the way through chapter 10. And this is a really interesting section of scripture here because this is the last stint of ministry that Jesus will do in the Galilee region. And so we'll see here that there are a number of stories, if you read through this section, that you may have picked up on that have to do with sight, of Jesus healing the blind and also ministering to those who are spiritually blind. We see in this section of scripture that Jesus has largely left behind his ministry to the crowds, that his focus now is on his disciples and how he can pour into them. In fact, 3 times over this short span of scripture, Jesus will tell them specifically, his disciples, that he is going to be arrested, tried, and crucified. And so we see this kind of really intense focus on them. So our first passage we're going to look at within here comes from Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. And I'm going to read this story for us if you want to turn there. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Do not go into the village." There's some interesting things kind of happening here, and one thing that might have stood out to you was the fact that Jesus took this blind man outside of the village before he healed him. Now, why would Jesus do that? Well, we find that later in the Gospels, Bethsaida, the town in which they were in, is identified as a place that was very hard-hearted toward Jesus. That they didn't meet Jesus with faith when he came and did miracles in their midst, and therefore Jesus removes a man from a faithless people so that their faithlessness would not hinder ministry. And there's something to be said about that. Another interesting thing here is that the man isn't healed immediately. You'll notice in the first go-around, Jesus puts his saliva, he spits in the man, his hands, I assume, and put his hands on the man's eyes. And he begins to see, but his vision is cloudy. He sees people. Now he goes from not seeing anything to seeing kind of the outline of people, but it's blurry, and he can't make any distinction on what he's seeing. It isn't until Jesus lays his hands on him a second time that the man's sight is fully restored and he sees clearly. Now, I think this is interesting because we see that the man begins to see in stages, and with each stage, his sight is further clarified. And I think this is a compelling image for spiritual growth in what we call sanctification, where we are growing in grace. You know, part of growing in grace is that we begin our picture of Jesus, our vision of Jesus, continues to be clarified. That maybe we begin by having kind of this outline, blurred vision of Christ, but the more we come to know him and search him out in the scriptures, that vision of him begins to be clarified and takes perhaps a more detailed and defined shape. You know, I think evidence of God's grace being at work in us is that our vision of Christ is always being clarified, that it's always growing and becoming more defined. You know, some people, I think, some Christians are satisfied with a blurry kind of just seeing the outline or some shape of Christ. But if we want to know him deeply, we must yearn to see Jesus for who he is. And so I want to ask you the question. I wonder how you are growing in your understanding of Christ. Or using the image we've just spent some time with, how is your vision of who Jesus is being clarified? I want you to stop the video and have some discussion for a moment. Our second story comes from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 13. And we're going to look at this. This is the story of the Transfiguration. Just an amazing story. When Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain and he is transfigured before them. And for a moment, these disciples see Jesus in all of his true glory. It's like the veil is lifted and they see the magnificence of Christ and his true identity before their very eyes. We see that when this happens, that the presence of God surrounds them. And in verse 7, listen to verses 7 and 8. It says, "Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them," the cloud being the presence of God. "And a voice came from the cloud, 'This is my Son whom I love. Listen to him.'" Now, what you'll notice is that there's a lot of similarity between Jesus' baptism and the Transfiguration, and namely being the presence of the Father there and the voice of the Father over his Son, Jesus. Now, in the baptism and in the Transfiguration, the first statement that God makes over a son is the same. "This is my Son," an identifying statement, "whom I love," right? The love of the Father is affirmed both at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and as he is moving towards the end of his ministry and coming to Jerusalem. But the places they differ is the last statement the Father has over a son. At the baptism, you'll remember that the Father says, "This is my Son whom I love. In him I am well pleased." But here at the Transfiguration, God says, "This is my Son whom I love. Listen to him." Listen to him. Now, why would he say this? Well, I think the most important thing that we can do as disciples of Jesus Christ is to listen to him. You look at here specifically, Jesus has told the disciples 3 times now that he's going to be arrested, tried, and crucified, and still they do not understand. And so God is saying, listen to him. And I wonder in what ways the Father is saying that same thing to us. Would you listen to my Son whom I love? You know, I think as those who seek to follow Jesus, if we want to have any hope of becoming like Jesus or doing the things that he did, we must listen to him. We must search his words out in Scripture with a desire to follow him and listen to him in every way. And so my question for you really stems out of that, and it's this. I wonder how you are listening to Jesus. I wonder how you're listening to Jesus. And I wonder what that means to you. I want you to stop the video for a moment and have some conversation. So come back, we're going to look at the story following the Transfiguration. This is a story of the healing of a boy with an evil spirit. We find that a father brings his son who has been possessed by a demon to the disciples to be healed, and yet the disciples are unable to cast out the demon. Now, this is after Jesus has already given the disciples authority to do that. And we see in Mark so far, they've already been casting out demons, yet they find this one that they're unable to cast out. So the father brings the boy to Jesus. And he says to Jesus, "If you can, will you help?" Jesus says, "If you can." Anything is possible for him who believes. Well, Jesus ends up casting out the demon. And a little bit later, the disciples, when they're in private, stop Jesus and they say, "Why were we unable to cast out this demon?" And Jesus says something very interesting to them in verse 29 in chapter 9. He says this, "This kind can come out only by prayer Now, I find this to be a very fascinating response. And it evokes a couple of questions out of me. And the first is, were they not praying? I mean, what were they doing? If they weren't praying to cast out this demon, then what were they doing? What means were they using? Was it that they weren't praying out of faith? Maybe they weren't exercising genuine, deep-seated faith. Maybe they weren't really praying out of the power that Jesus had given them, or maybe they weren't praying at all. I don't know. We don't know. That's not clarified here in the story. But the question is nonetheless a compelling one for us. Are we praying? Are we praying prayers that are rooted in faith? Are we praying fervently? Are we praying in power? Are we praying with a sense of urgency, or even praying, finding a sense of joy from praying? And that question stood out to me, and I want to pose it to you because we're in a trying season right now, and I know many of us feel oppressed. We're emotionally and spiritually exhausted by COVID-19. We're so done with this right now, and oftentimes when we find ourselves in these desert places spiritually, some of the first things to go in our practices is our prayer life. The very thing that fills us with spiritual vitality is often the first to go. And so I want to ask you, are you praying? Are you just going through the motions, or are you truly seeking God in deep and earnest prayer? So my question I want you to answer, and the question we'll close with, is I want you to be honest. Are you engaged in prayer right now? Are you not just are you doing it, are you engaged? Praying out of faith and power. Wesley asked the question this way: are you enjoying prayer? You can answer that question as well. And I want you to close by, practicing that kind of prayer together as a group or a family or an individual if you're watching this video. But I want to thank you for being with us, and I pray that as we look over Mark's gospel and take these stories, that we're challenged by them to be more committed followers of Christ, seeking to become like Christ in order to do what Jesus did. Thank you so much for joining us.